There was no fury in his eyes. Fury is human, and Jozef Slovák had left humanity behind long ago. In that damp, mold-streaked basement, death wasn't a tragic event, it was a technical procedure. He watched the victim's fingers scrape one last time against the cold concrete, a final, instinctive attempt to cling to a shred of existence. Slovák didn't flinch. He simply tightened the cord with surgical precision, calculating the necessary tension as if he were fitting a part in a factory. When the struggle finally ceased, he felt no remorse, only a cold, mathematical satisfaction. He straightened his coat collar, wiped the fog of the victim's final breath from his glasses, and stepped through the metal door, which let out a long, screeching moan. Outside, the night air was fresh. To any passerby, he was just a middle-aged man returning late from a shift. A polite neighbor, a model citizen. But in his mind, he had just returned from the edge of the abyss. This is the well of monsters. A place where the human soul is replaced by a void. Jozef Slovák didn't just fall into this well, he built it. In the gray, industrial landscapes of 1950s Czechoslovakia, Jozef was a ghost in plain sight. While the world around him was rebuilding from the wreckage of war, he was building something far more sinister within himself. He didn't just inhabit the shadows, he mastered them. He was the invisible child, the one who sat at the edge of the playground, not because he was shy, but because he was hunting for data. He watched how children cried when they fell, how teachers' voices changed when they were frustrated, and how easily adults could be manipulated by a simple, polite smile. To Jozef, human emotions were not something to feel, they were a roadmap of vulnerabilities. He began to see the world as a collection of locks, and he was the master key. There were no grand outbursts of rage to warn the world of what was coming. Instead, there was a cold, growing detachment, a thickening of the skin that separated him from the rest of humanity. He learned the most dangerous lesson a monster can acquire: if you stay quiet enough, people stop looking at you. They stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as part of the furniture. And that is when the mask became permanent. He wasn't just observing human weakness, he was cataloging it, preparing for the day when he would no longer be the observer but the executioner. By the time he reached his teens, he was no longer an idea, it was his reality. The year was 1978. In the bustling transit hubs of Bratislava, Jozef Slovák moved like a ghost through the crowds. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was looking for a specific type of vulnerability. He found it in a young woman from Yugoslavia named Blaženka G. She was a traveler, far from home and disconnected from her safety net. To Jozef, she wasn't a person with a story, she was a variable in a dark equation he was desperate to solve. Jozef approached her not with shadows, but with a polite, helpful smile. Using his mask of sanity, his soft, measured tone and unassuming glasses, he offered her directions or perhaps a lead on a place to stay. He projected the image of a safe, unremarkable local. He lured her away from the crowded station, guiding her toward the secluded, wooded outskirts of the city. To Blaženka, it was a shortcut suggested by a kind stranger. To Jozef, it was the walk to her execution. Once the city noise faded into the rustle of the trees, the neighbor vanished. Without warning or a word of anger, Jozef struck. He didn't use a weapon that required heat or passion, he used a cord. This allowed him to maintain a clinical distance, standing behind her as he tightened the grip. He watched with a terrifying, silent curiosity as the life left her body, studying the transition from a living human to an inanimate object. He didn't just kill her, he observed the mechanics of her death. Blaženka's body was found abandoned in the brush, a sight that sent a shiver through the local authorities. The crime was so cold and devoid of typical motives like robbery that it stood out even in an era of strict state control. The Bratislava strangler had left his first mark, but he had also left a trail. Despite his calculations, Jozef was still a novice at covering his tracks. Several people at the transit station remembered seeing a quiet man with glasses speaking to the young foreign traveler. When the Czechoslovakian police finally tracked him down and raided his world, they didn't find a trembling criminal, they found a man of ice. Jozef sat through the questioning with a disturbing calmness that unnerved the veteran detectives. He didn't break, he simply observed the investigators as if they were another experiment. In 1978 he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in the notorious Leopoldov prison. The public felt safe, believing the monster was locked away forever. They didn't realize that for Jozef this was just an intermission, a 12-year period of silence where he would refine his mask and wait for the world to break so he could walk free again. While Jozef was behind bars, history was moving outside. In 1989, the Velvet Revolution toppled the communist regime. In the chaotic dawn of the new democracy in 1990, the government made a fatal gesture of mercy, a massive presidential amnesty. But Jozef Slovák didn't just walk out, he manipulated his way out. During his 12 years in the shadows of Leopoldov prison, he had become a scholar of the human mind. He spent thousands of hours devouring psychology books, studying the mechanics of empathy, guilt, and reform, not to heal himself but to learn how to mimic them. He practiced the micro-expressions of a reformed man until his reflection in the cell mirror looked like a saint. He convinced the new, idealistic officials of the post-communist era that he was a changed man, a victim of the old regime's harshness who had found his way back to morality. To the board, he wasn't a predator, he was a success story. They looked at his clinical, calm face and saw peace. They didn't realize they were looking at a masterclass in psychological manipulation. They believed him. The heavy gates of Leopoldov creaked open, and the system unleashed a more refined, more dangerous predator. Armed with a deeper understanding of how to deceive the human eye, Jozef Slovák walked into the fresh air of 1990. He was about to claim 4 more lives in a single year of terror. Free once again, Jozef didn't wait. He moved with a terrifying speed that the disorganized, newly formed police force couldn't track. Between 1990 and 1991, 4 more women, Blaženka, Elena, Jana, and a final, tragic victim, vanished. His method was now perfected. He would offer a ride, a polite conversation, or help in a park. He was the man with the glasses, the man who looked like a teacher or a clerk. But as soon as the car door locked or they reached the deep brush of the woods, the psychology books were set aside, and the cord came out. He was no longer just testing a theory, he was an efficient machine of death, leaving a trail of bodies that the nation, in its new freedom, was not prepared to handle. He knew that the police were struggling with a surge in crime following the revolution. He used this chaos to hide. He would drive his car, a symbol of his new status, and pick up hitchhikers or women waiting for buses. He used his knowledge of psychology to mirror their emotions, making them feel safe, making them trust him. To them, he was a savior on a lonely road. To him, they were already ghosts. His spree came to a chilling conclusion with his final victim, a young woman who would inadvertently become the key to his downfall. In 1991, Jozef lured her into his vehicle using the same calm, practiced deception. He drove her to a secluded area near the forest, his heart rate likely as steady as a surgeon's. When the mask of sanity finally dropped, he attacked with the cord, expecting the same quick result he had achieved with the others. But this time, something was different. She fought back with a desperation he hadn't accounted for in his psychological blueprints. Even though he ultimately overpowered and murdered her, the struggle was messy. The perfect machine had made a mistake. He left her body in a shallow grave, but in his haste and arrogance, he left behind forensic evidence that he hadn't anticipated. He believed he was untouchable, that the system he had tricked once would never be smart enough to catch him again. He was wrong. The girl he murdered became the ghost that led the police directly to his doorstep. Unlike his earlier crimes where he was meticulously clean, the struggle with his final victim, Dagmar, was his undoing. She fought for her life with a ferocity that caught him off guard. In the struggle, Jozef left behind physical evidence, fibers and biological traces that linked his vehicle and his person to the crime scene. For the first time, he wasn't just a shadow man, he was a man with a physical connection to a corpse. In the new, free Czechoslovakia, people were more observant than he realized. Witnesses had spotted a specific car, a Skoda, near the areas where the women had vanished. Investigative work narrowed down the owners of such vehicles in the Bratislava region who also had criminal records. When the name Jozef Slovák popped up, a man already convicted of a similar murder in 1978, the red flags went up across the department. Jozef had become overconfident. He believed that since he had outsmarted the system to get his amnesty, the police were beneath him. He stopped changing his patterns. He continued to hunt in the same Bratislava triangle, believing that the disorganized, post-revolutionary police force was too busy dealing with street crime to notice a serial predator. When the police finally closed in on his apartment in 1991, they didn't find a man hiding. They found him sitting calmly, almost as if he had been expecting them, or rather, as if he were waiting for an audience. As they searched his space, they found trophies and evidence that linked him not just to one, but to all four of the recent disappearances. The mask of sanity didn't break during the arrest, it transformed into a mask of pure, cold arrogance. Why did they come? Because the system he mocked had finally caught up. They came because a girl fought back, because a car was spotted, and because his 1978 file, the one he thought was buried, was still sitting in a drawer, waiting for a detective to connect the dots. The interrogation room was small, smelling of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. Across the table sat the detectives, men who had spent sleepless nights following a trail of blood. And there, sitting as calmly as if he were waiting for a bus, was Jozef Slovák. When they laid the forensic photos and the DNA results on the table, the definitive proof of his struggle with his final victim, they expected him to break. They expected a confession or a plea for mercy. Instead, Jozef leaned back. A slow, dry chuckle rattled in his throat, a sound devoid of joy. It was the sound of a predator who knew he had already won, even in defeat. He looked the lead investigator directly in the eye, his glasses reflecting the harsh fluorescent light. "You think you caught me because you're smart? You caught me because I allowed the game to end. I played your mercy like an instrument. I watched you struggle with your new democracy while I walked your streets. You gave me the keys to the city when you opened that prison gate, and I used them to show you what freedom really looks like." He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't deny a single charge. Instead, he treated the interrogation as a lecture. He began to describe the psychology of his victims, how he had used the very books he read in prison to mirror their fears and desires. He was proud of his work. Then came the most disturbing part of the investigation. Jozef offered the police a grand tour. He led a convoy of officers into the dense woods of the Bratislava outskirts. As they walked through the brush, he didn't hang his head in shame. He pointed out the shallow graves with the enthusiasm of a tour guide showing off historical landmarks. "Here is where Blaženka sleeps," he would say, mocking the detectives for every day they had spent searching just meters away from where he stood. He remembered every detail, every breath, every second of his crimes. He wanted them to know that while they were following procedures, he was following his instincts, and his instincts were always superior. The game was over. In 1993, the court handed down a life sentence, ensuring that Jozef Slovák would never again walk the streets he had turned into a hunting ground. He was sent back to Leopoldov prison, the same fortress he had manipulated his way out of just years before. But this time, the world had learned its lesson. There would be no second amnesty. There would be no more psychology books to help him sharpen his mask of sanity. Inside those gray stone walls, Jozef Slovák ceased to be a predator and became a ghost. He lived out his final years in a silence so profound it was as if he had already ceased to exist. He didn't seek forgiveness. He didn't show remorse. He simply sat in the void he had created for himself, a man who had traded every ounce of his humanity for a brief, blood-soaked moment of power. He died behind bars in 2014, taking the full map of his darkness to the grave. He left behind a legacy of terror and a chilling reminder that haunts the nation to this day, that sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows. They are the ones who walk among us in the light of day, holding the door open, offering a polite, unremarkable smile, and waiting for the moment you lower your guard. Jozef Slovák was the proof that evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it just watches. And once you've looked into the eyes of a man like that, the world never looks quite the same again. Jozef Slovák is gone, but the shadows he left behind remain. If this deep dive into the mind of a predator disturbed you as much as it did me, let me know in the comments. What do you think was the biggest failure, the man himself or the system that let him walk free? I want to hear your theories and your thoughts on this case. If you want to see more stories that explore the darkest corners of human nature, hit that like button and subscribe to join us. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching. Stay vigilant and I'll see you at the bottom of the well.